Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel, and this is part two of a two-part presentation. In part one, which you can see on YouTube, I discussed this, particularly this very fascinating case where Japan gave up the gun, had the gun, and gave it up actually during what was called the Tokugawa shogunate, and went back to the sword and supposed code of the warrior, the samurai warrior, and had a very relatively peaceful and prosperous society until it was forced open by the United States, and then how it became a modern society, an extremely successful modern society, a warlike society, lost the war, and then semi-demilitarized. It became even a more modern and progressive and social industrial society. What I would like to explain is the role culture plays in explaining how the Japanese and why the Japanese changed as they did. And to do this, let me begin with an analogy. The way I sort of use as a metaphor for Japan is a lacquered tablet created out of bamboo. If you have a lacquered tablet in painting, it's very rigid, and in fact, the Japanese are great artists in lacquer and such. But if you break that lacquer tablet and it's made of bamboo, bamboo actually is very flexible. So you can break the lacquer and not break the bamboo. And then when that happens, what do? You re-lacquer the bamboo. And that is one of my metaphors for what happens in Japan. You have to understand that what this involves is an assertion that there are fundamentals of Japanese culture that endure and craft how it adapts and adopts different things. And in fact, much of what I'm talking to you about goes back to a period when we were actually fighting Japan, and people had very many different worries, concerns, and opinions about how the Japanese were going to react to a military defeat. And in fact, they reacted different than most people thought, but they didn't react differently than certain anthropologists told them they were going to react, which was basically that when it finally became totally evident that they had lost, in fact, rather than die to the end, they would actually adopt and adapt. To do this, I quickly have to say that you have to understand what we're talking about is culture, and you have to have an understanding of what is culture. Very often people think culture is a collection of goods or institutions. Those are really manifestations of cultures. They're containers of culture. But culture is really patterns of perception and behavior that are inculcated and passed on between generations within a society and actually affect the way people perceive and react to things in a predictable, inheritable, cultural fashion. And that includes how they perceive and react to change. Culture is not static. Culture is ever-changing, but culture determines the way people change. So in Japan, we've had this amazing society that constantly can adapt and change. Now, what are those key values that have allowed it to do this? Well, let me give you what I say are the key values. A combination of intense individual and social discipline, seen as one ability to act this in a disciplined fashion. Conscious, and this word is very important because what's often very different between Japanese culture and other cultures, everyone has these, but the degree to which they are conscious, the Japanese are conscious of them and react on a conscious level to them. A conscious social and economic hierarchy that is engineered, and the importance of always maintaining relations, including very subtle relations, perhaps, again, epitomized by when Japanese bow to each other, tremendous differences in the heights at which they bow based upon the relative social status of each of the parties. Another aspect, they have a public rigidity coupled with an individual capacity for responsibility for responsiveness. So everything seems very rigid, but behind it all, it's rigid because everybody is being so sensitive in the way they respond and take responsibility to responding to everything else that it comes out almost as a choreographed play. But it's choreographed because everybody is playing their roles so well. Now, in terms of cultural explanations, an understanding or a paradigm or a perspective that has been used several times is to make the distinction between what we would call shame cultures and guilt cultures, and how the Japanese are a shame culture, not a guilt culture. Basically, a shame culture. In shame, you're embarrassed because others perceive you in a way you don't wish to be perceived and embarrass you. You're ashamed. One in the case you might blush. You notice people in America don't blush anymore. It's almost impossible. We're not. We're. It's almost impossible for anybody to be ashamed of anything in America today. Uh, but in a shame culture, people are ashamed when somebody perceives them as doing something that isn't proper. That isn't necessarily that they feel bad, they're ashamed that they're being perceived as that. The opposite is a guilt culture. In a guilt culture, you internalize the feeling that you've done wrong, whether or not people know you've done it. They may think you're a nice guy, but you know you've actually stolen all their money, and you feel guilty about it. And a classic culture that's seen as a guilt culture is Jewish culture. A classic example of guilt in Jewish culture is when traditionally, very often, mothers got mad at their children. What they would do is stop talking to their child. And the child then goes absolutely bonkers, trying to figure out why the mother won't talk to them, and internalizes a very bad feeling that it's done something very wrong, which may or may not be what the mother is really upset about, but it doesn't matter, because what has been achieved is the child feels really bad and is ready to surrender. Uh, in order to relieve itself of this guilt. Well, the Japanese are a shame culture. They are very aware of how others see them. And if the others don't see them in the way that is socially appropriate, that's when they tend to react and what they try to prevent. It's when you take those combination of things that you get a society that can look very rigid, like the Japanese, but in fact is capable, once it decides it has to suddenly reformulate itself in a new fashion that looks very rigid, but actually inside is very similar. And that's what's happened many times in Japan. And their ability to do it is personified by another major transformation. And that's what happened after World War II. In World War II, what happened was, among other things, there was an amazing transformation of Japanese industry. Edward Deming was an American U.S. Census Bureau employee who was with the Army in occupied Japan, came back to America and devised a new system, the Deming system of quality control, in which he argued that statistics and quantification were important for assessment and evaluation, but they didn't motivate people. What motivated people were values. And he tried to convince American corporations that values for quality was what they should be emphasizing in their corporation, rather than just technical specs about how many rejected parts versus accepted parts were acceptable. They didn't buy it. So he went back to Japan, because in Japan, again, what's so unusual, every society has values, but it's the consciousness of the Japanese as to their values and how they use it and the importance of those values that make them unique. The Japanese embraced Edward Deming. One of the greatest prizes given every year in Japan is the Deming Award to outstanding businesses and industries. And building on his system, companies such as Sony and Toyota became the poster children of quality production in the world, again because of this value orientation. So what are the lessons that I'm trying to say we should bring from Japan as far as peace and as far as development? Well, there are actually three. One, a society can change very fast when it wants to and has to. And the Japanese have demonstrated that many times. Second, that values, when consciously understood, can become a very, very powerful mechanism for reorganizing society. And the third is that peace and the choice of reducing your ability to have destructive confrontation is possible is not only possible, but has been done and has corresponded with increased prosperity